if we're conserving plants in Jordan, obviously we're conserving them for benefit of Jordanian people. But I think if you want to have funding to conserve plants in Jordan, then if you just rely on Jordanian funding sources, then you have limited options. One thing that is key to me is if we want global food security, Jordan is crucial in providing that food security. So if we want, for instance, I can't see the people from the European Union who were here earlier, but if we want to have food security in Europe, then where should we be looking to get the genetic resources to have food security? In Jordan. Jordan's the country, because the amount of genetic diversity in Europe compared with the amount of genetic diversity here in the Fertile Crescent, there's no comparison. There's a degree of magnitude more here. So the funding needs to come from Europe to Jordan to do this conservation. I'm making that point clearly before I start, because I think it's the most important thing. Right, okay, let's get on. Okay, so I'm going to look very briefly at food insecurity and perhaps counting on what I've just mentioned. Then I'm going to look at crop wild relatives and then look at crop wild relatives in Jordan. In between that, I'm going to switch looking briefly at the Fertile Crescent, and then I'm going to make some final remarks about the strategy, which Joanna will give a talk on in a minute, and some other ideas for future conservation and work in the region. And specifically, I put this slide here on the side of these women. This is to make the link that Dr. Amri has just made so eloquently. There's no point in doing conservation unless we link conservation to use. So the only reason for going out and collecting, the only reason for doing in situ conservation is to utilize that material. So people must benefit from the material that we actually use and conserve. An alternative title for my talk, which was maybe somewhat overselling it, is how conserving plants in Jordan can save the world. And I hope I've already illustrated why that is so important. But I checked yesterday at the number of human beings on the planet. The figure yesterday was 7.22 billion human beings. Yesterday. 78% of them live in developing countries. They need food to have a secure, enjoyable, healthy life. By 2050, it's estimated that 99.6 billion people will exist, a huge increase, and that 86% of them will be living in developing countries. So there is this whole process. We have these wonderful children here, but basically we have too many children. And if we're going to continue feeding them, as the figure that Aichi gave us this morning, is if we want to feed all those people by 2050, then we have to have an increase in production of 60% of agriculture. 60% increase in food production. At the same time as that, we're going to have a reduction. Why are we going to have a reduction? Not only not going to have an increase in food production, we're likely to have, unless we take strong mitigating actions, a reduction as a result of climate change. So this is a figure from the latest IPCC report published a couple of weeks ago, and although it's a complicated figure, you can see here, these figures show the predicted range. So this is an increase in production as a result of climate change. This is a decrease. And as you can see, as time goes on, the models predict very small chance of increased production, but a very large chance of decreased production. So that's why I'm saying if we want to feed people in the future, we have to look more precisely to food security and conservation of the elements of food security. Okay, so that's the introduction. Crop wild relatives. The only point I want to make here is that the concept of the crop wild relative is relative. Not all crop wild relatives have equal value. And certainly if you're dealing with national programs in the region, the ones that have highest values are the ones that are easiest to cross with your crop. So you can do it by conventional hybridization. So usually when we're focusing on conservation of crop wild relatives, we would focus on conserving those in gene pool 1B first, then gene pool 2. And if we don't know about the gene pool concept, then taxon group 1 to 3, because those are the ones that are easiest to get the gene transfer from the crop wild relative, the wild species, to the crop. the number of traits. It's not just for pest and disease resistance. There are an enormous number of traits that have been taken from crop wild relatives and used in breeding. So this is the example taken from euglops and other wheat wild relatives. And this is just to show that the use of crop wild relatives varies from crop to crop. So if we, for instance, compare here the use with wheat, so this is the dark blue is the number of references published citing the use of crop wild relatives in breeding, and the green are the number of species. So you can see it varies from species to species. So some species like wheat, rice, barley, cassava, all have fairly extensive use of crop wild relatives. Not exhaustive. Interestingly, not all crop wild relatives have been attempted crossing and used in breeding. So we still have a lot of potential to do further exploitation. And we can see over here that over time, the use of crop wild relatives is increasing rapidly. And I want to talk specifically now, move over to talking about a specific project, which has been mentioned a couple of times if we're talking about crop wild relatives. This is the Global Crop Diversity Trust Project, with funding from the Norwegian government. It was the one that got all the headlines, $50 million being spent on crop wild relative conservation and use. 50 million, but most of the money was going on utilisation, actually developing techniques for crossing the crop wild relative with the crop, and 8 million went on conservation. That 8 million is being spent in the first 5 years of the project. We've just finished the third year of the project. And to lay out what we're doing in terms of conservation, first of all, identifying gene pools and taxon groups for 92 genera. Within the 92 genera, there are 194 crops. Then we collated ecogeographic data. Then we did gap analysis using the two basic techniques. Then we did field collection. So basically, we're focusing on field collection now, and then doing ex situ storage, and that's Svalbard material will be in national gene banks and regional gene banks, but a backup set put in Svalbard as well. So just to go through that a bit more slowly, so I said we were working on 90 genera, so we identified as key the ones that are in Annex 1 of the International Treaty. For political reasons, there are some major crops not included in the International Treaty, so we put those crops back in and came up with a list of 194. Then, as I said, we looked at gene pool and taxon group concepts. Another thing that we didn't use was threat. So obviously, if you're conserving species, the ones that are most likely to go extinct have a higher priority. Now, in this particular case, we didn't use threat as a priority, but if you're doing this in a national development of a national strategy, then you would obviously look at threat as well. Then, if putting all that data together, you can look at the distribution of those crop wild relative species, and the highest number are found in legumes. Legumes has the most species of crop wild relative. In total, the list has 1,667 taxa from the 194 crops, 1,392 species, and there is a checklist or inventory available which you can check. You can see how many species from your country. For instance, Jordan has 97 of these key international species that are priority for conservation of wild relatives. This is just looking at the geographical distribution of those, and these are all the different regions, but maybe it's easier to see this if we look at a map. The area that by far has the highest concentration of crop wild relatives is here. It is the Fertile Crescent. So there are, of these 1,667 taxa, 262 of them are found in the Fertile Crescent. Then the second region is China, and then we go down the list. But the point I'm making is that this region has global importance, not just national importance. I want to keep on coming back to that to stress it. Right, so that's just talking about that project. Now I want to look a bit more at the Fertile Crescent. Now I had a discussion with various colleagues about the Fertile Crescent, and I said, who was the person who actually came up with the name Fertile Crescent? And I never got to the bottom of it. I don't know who was the first person to come up with the Fertile Crescent, but basically it's a crescent-shaped area north of the Arabian Syrian desert, which is moist, fertile, mountainous, with major rivers. It's also the cradle of civilization, associated with some of the ancient cultures. And it was first defined, I think, not in botanical terms, but in archaeological terms. So it is the area which is associated with the origin of agriculture. The origin of agriculture happened in 3 locations. Interestingly, it happened in China before it happened here in your region. But by far, I think the more important species have been taken up in this region. The person who first wrote a book titled The Fertile Crescent was Brestek in 1916, fairly recent. I was quite surprised to see that was the first published reference to it. Where is the Fertile Crescent? So there is no standard reference book. You can go and see where the Fertile Crescent is, but you can see of these 3 images I've taken from the internet, basically some of them including the Nile Delta, some including Cyprus, others just including the Arc on the mainland. But basically the Fertile Crescent includes this area: northern Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon, western Syria, southeast Turkey, Caucasus, northwest Iraq and west Iran. And also, interestingly, it's the abutment of 2 Vavilov centres, which I think also Dr. Amri mentioned earlier. So you have the Central Asian area, which comes in from below the Caspian, and they meet actually here in the Fertile Crescent and the Mediterranean centre, as you can see here. Fine. Interestingly, Vavilov also kept on changing his mind. So there are about 8 papers written by Vavilov on the centres of diversity. Each one has a different map. So it's interesting how it's changed over time. So as I said, cradle of agricultural origin, centre of agricultural development, large numbers of crop-like relatives and diversity in those crop-like relatives found within the region. And this, I think, is largely associated with the species here being predisposed to domestication. In other words, they have certain characters that make them likely to become crop plants. And I've listed them all there, but I mean, we won't go through them. So let's look at the 2 Vavilov centres. As I said, the 2 centres abut here, and we have a long list of crops that are associated with coming from this region. I think if you were to add up the commercial value of the crops from this centre, it would possibly add up to about 80% of the global value in crops. So the point I'm making again is that it's not just important for the country of Jordan, this is important for the world that we conserve these species here. So wealth, and as I said, the information on the actual species that are present here are present in this database or inventory which is available online, which includes, for the whole of the Fertile Crescent, 262 priority species, as I said, 97 for Jordan. As well as having that diversity is threatened. I haven't found in the literature good data on particular studies of the levels of species erosion or genetic diversity loss. There is just one study done by one of my students in Syria. But in that particular case, the material was being lost rapidly as a result of overgrazing, quarry development, and house building, urbanization. So not only do you have diversity, but that diversity is threatened. So you need to conserve it now. If we look specifically at the Jordanian Flora, my figures, I must be using an old figure here because it's slightly different to the figure that Shahida was using earlier. But basically it's about 2,600 species, of which over 2,000 of them are crop-like relatives. So by this definition, what we're looking at is a species that's found in the same genus as a crop. So for instance, if we're taking Vicia fabra as an example, all other species of Vicia are by definition crop-like relatives, because you could potentially cross them. And so those 2,000 species are present in 484 genera from 100 families. Again, not surprisingly, the legumes come out as the one with the highest number of taxa, followed by the gramineae. Okay, so let's look again, go back to the international, the global picture. So this is probably the last conference I'll show you this slide. So this is some analysis we did a few years ago for FAO, looking at 14 crop gene pools, and we did gap analysis, as Dr. Amri was talking about earlier, and we identified the triangles are locations where we would want to set up in situ conservation as a result of looking at these 14 gene pools and where the crop wild relatives were located. Now, the reason it will be the last time I show this slide is because my students are literally finishing as we speak the analysis for the whole global set, for the whole 1,667 species. What we have finished is looking at ex situ priorities. So if you take that database of 1,667 species, crop wild relatives, global crop wild relatives, and for instance you look at overall taxon richness, then the top slide shows you the areas that have the highest taxon richness, which again, clearly you can see coming out Turkey and the Fertile Crescent as the areas that have the highest richness. The next one down shows collecting hotspots per taxa combined. So this is all the different hotspots of diversity for the under-collected species. And here you can see again the Fertile Crescent and Turkey, and interestingly Europe and some areas in China come out as high priority areas, and then the hotspots per country, gene pool combined, again Fertile Crescent and Turkey. Now this is the first result. This paper will be published, we're submitting it to Nature, so it should be out fairly soon. So that's looking at, we couldn't get data on all the 1,667 taxa, so that's why it's a slightly smaller number. So this is looking at 1,187 crop wild relatives from 81 gene pools. And then what I've done, I said I can't show you the final in situ analysis results, but what I got one of my students to do a specific analysis for the Fertile Crescent, just the Fertile Crescent countries for in situ conservation. And I've listed here the 6 sites that come out within your region as having the highest priority for in situ conservation for 96 priority crop wild relatives within the region, 8,850 data points, and the best spot comes out as this one here in Israel. The second spot is this one up here on the Syrian-Turkish border. The third one is further over, and you've already seen that from Dr. Amri's talk as one of the priority spots. But the fourth one is right here. So the fourth best spot for conservation of crop wild relatives in the Fertile Crescent is on the northern border between Israel and Jordan. Yes? A clear indication that Jordanian plants have a very, very high priority for conservation. Okay, so associated with that, we should be developing national strategies. Aichi talked this morning about the national strategies. Dr. Amri mentioned them again. Other people have mentioned them. This is the methodology for how you would develop a national strategy. And so Joanna is going to, in the next presentation, is going to talk about how that has actually been done in Jordan. So I'm not going to steal her glory, but just to make the point that you should end up with clear advice on where to do your in situ conservation, where to do your ex situ collecting. So you need to come up with a clear statement. It's not just saying we want to do conservation in Jordan, it's where in Jordan we're actually going to do that specific conservation. Right, so I think this is my final slide, and so I have some general points I wanted to make. So the first is I've talked about Vavilov centres, and you've heard other people talking about Vavilov centres. So I think the first point to make is that Vavilov centres were formulated not just on the number of crop wild relatives present. They were also formulated on the level of crop diversity. So there is a huge number of crop land races present in Jordan. So as well as wanting to conserve the wild species which are related to crops, you should be focusing, as an external person, I'm allowed hopefully to give you this advice, on conserving the land races of crops also present in Jordan in the region. The second one is that Jordanian plants the important plants are not just crop biodiversity. I'm very pleased to hear that several people have made the point about medicinal plants. Dr. Amri specifically mentioned, I think it was Dr. Amri or someone else mentioned the Jeff medicinal project on plants. There is no one here talking about it. I don't know what's happened to those sites after the end of that project, but one would hope they are still being actively conserved. So make sure, don't focus just on crop biodiversity. Medicinal plants are also very important. Bringing back to this slide of the women here preparing some food. Use. We have to keep on coming back to use. Benefit to the people in the local community. Dr. Amri had that nice slide of the guy in the very dry area. Why should he continue growing his barley? The only reason he'd continue to grow his barley if his family can be fed and prosper from him doing that job. Yes? So in other words, we must link conservation to some form of use. A couple of next steps. Joanna is going to talk to you about the wild plant species conservation plan for Jordan. I'm not going to prejudge what Joanna is going to say, but just to say, unless it's implemented, unless the strategy is agreed and implemented, we've wasted our time doing it, yes? We must implement the actual work that's been agreed. And the next step is, we talked a lot about developing national strategies. What about a regional strategy? Dr. Amri talked about a regional strategy, but does it actually, have you done the gap analysis? Do you know exactly where you would want to set up? If you were just looking at regional crop viability, regional medicinal species, where you would do in situ conservation, where you actually need to fill the gaps in ex situ conservation. That should be your priority for the future, in my view. Thank you very much.